It started as just another quiet Saturday morning in the neighborhood. The sun had barely risen, and the street lay in that soft golden light where the dew still clings to the grass. My driveway was just like it always was, clean, wide enough for my car, and sitting exactly where it had for years. Nothing about it should have drawn attention. But over the last few weeks, I had noticed little signs that someone had been paying too much attention to it. First, there was the anonymous note tucked under my windshield wiper, short, scrawled handwriting demanding I stop parking in unauthorized spaces. At first, I laughed. This was my own driveway, my own property, and there was no HOA rule in existence that could tell me otherwise. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, but it was only the first drop of what would become a storm. Then, a week later, I found a fresh scratch along the side of my car. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate, an ugly, zigzagged mark that screamed of petty vandalism. My security camera footage showed nothing clear, just a shadow passing across the lens. I didn't want to believe it was a neighbor. People around here waved at each other, shared holiday cookies, and helped shovel snow in winter. At least, that's what I thought. That's when Karen entered the picture. She lived 2 houses down, in a pristine white colonial with a lawn that looked like it belonged on a real estate brochure. She wasn't exactly new in the neighborhood, but she had recently been promoted to the HOA's unofficial enforcer, a role she seemed to take very personally. I'd seen her walking around with a clipboard, jotting down notes about overgrown bushes and recycling bins left out past collection day. The first direct sign of trouble came on a Monday morning. I stepped outside to head to work and saw her standing on the sidewalk across from my driveway, staring at my car like it was an abandoned wreck in the middle of the road. Her eyes moved slowly over the vehicle, lingering on my license plate, my inspection sticker, even the position of my tires against the curb. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just turned on her heel and marched back to her house. By the next weekend, I got the first official HOA letter in my mailbox. It claimed that my car was parked in a manner that obstructs neighborhood harmony, and that I needed to remove it immediately. The wording was vague, intentionally so. But I knew exactly who had written it. The HOA president lived on the other side of the neighborhood and barely knew me. This had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I ignored the letter. My car was parked entirely within my own driveway, and no HOA rule could dictate what I did there. Still, something in my gut told me this wasn't the end of it. Karen wasn't the type to drop something once she'd decided it was her business. A few days later, that gut feeling was proven right. It was early evening when I heard the low rumble of a tow truck idling on the street. At first, I thought it was for one of the rental houses further down, where parking disputes were common. But then I looked outside and saw it, massive, red, with its steel arm slowly lowering toward the back end of my car. The driver looked unsure, glancing toward Karen's front porch where she stood with her arms crossed, her phone in one hand and a smug, satisfied look on her face. She was watching like a hawk, clearly waiting for my car to be lifted off the ground. I rushed outside, heart pounding, every step fueled by disbelief and anger. The tow truck driver muttered something about getting a call from the HOA and removing unauthorized vehicles. But when I pointed out that this was my own driveway, he hesitated. Clearly, Karen had left out some very important details. That hesitation saved my car. The driver backed off, muttering about needing confirmation, and left. Karen, however, didn't look rattled. If anything, her smirk grew sharper, like this was just the opening move in whatever game she thought she was playing. And she was right, this was only the beginning. Because what I didn't know then was that she had already filed multiple complaints with the HOA and even the city's parking enforcement. She was building a case, one piece of paper at a time, with the sole intention of making sure my car, and maybe even I, would be gone from this street for good. But I wasn't the type to sit back and let someone like Karen dictate my life. If she wanted to play games, I'd play them better. The attempted tow had rattled me, but it hadn't surprised me. Karen had a way of locking onto a target like a hawk and circling endlessly until she got what she wanted. What surprised me was how bold she had been about it. She hadn't hidden behind the HOA's rules or the cover of a quiet complaint. She had stood right there in her yard, overseeing the operation like a general commanding troops. That told me one thing: she wasn't afraid of me, or of getting caught. Over the next week, the signs of her campaign became more obvious. I'd come home from work to find my garbage bins tipped over, even though there was no wind. My mailbox started to fill with HOA notices that all repeated the same vague accusations: unauthorized parking, obstruction of neighborhood harmony, non-compliant vehicle. The phrasing was intentionally slippery, the kind of language that gave the HOA wiggle room to interpret the rules however they wanted. And behind every letter, I could see Karen's smug face. One morning, I noticed a pair of unfamiliar men walking slowly past my house, cameras in hand, snapping photos of my driveway from different angles. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't knock on the door, just documented every possible infraction they could find. I later learned they were a third-party enforcement company hired by the HOA to gather evidence. Whether or not they realized it, they were being fed a false narrative by Karen. Still, my car remained exactly where it had always been, on my property, in my own driveway. She had no legal grounds to touch it, and yet, that didn't stop her from trying again. It was a Friday evening when I returned home to see the telltale flashing lights of a tow truck idling just a few houses away. I slowed down, watching as the truck inched forward toward my property. The driver leaned out, scanning the numbers on the curb, then turned into my driveway. I parked down the street, just out of sight, and watched as Karen emerged from her house. She was dressed for the occasion, clipboard in hand, HOA badge pinned to her sweater, phone out to record the removal of an unauthorized vehicle. Her self-importance radiated like heat, but before the tow truck could even lower its arm, I stepped out from the shadows and approached. The driver seemed uneasy, glancing between Karen's stern face and my calm, deliberate stride. I told him he might want to double-check his work order. The address was correct, but the legal authority to remove the car was not. I had already contacted the city's parking enforcement office earlier that week, and they confirmed what I knew all along: the HOA had no jurisdiction over vehicles parked in private driveways. The driver backed off again, this time quicker than before, muttering something about not wanting trouble. Karen's expression hardened. She didn't like losing in front of an audience, and now a few neighbors had stepped outside to watch. She turned without a word and stormed back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to echo down the street. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, pen, and a cup of coffee that went cold while I planned. It was clear she wasn't going to stop until she either embarrassed me or removed me entirely. If I wanted this to end, I couldn't just play defense, I had to take control of the game. The first step was gathering my own evidence. I installed 2 additional security cameras, one on the garage facing the driveway and another in the window facing the street. I adjusted them to capture not just my car, but the space across the street in front of Karen's house. If she wanted to play watchdog, I'd become the hawk watching her every move. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. Over the next few days, I recorded her parking her own car partially over the sidewalk, blocking pedestrian access, and occasionally even leaving it at the edge of a fire hydrant. Both were violations under the city's parking laws, real violations, unlike the ones she was fabricating about me. I also noticed something else. She had a habit of parking in the street overnight, even though city regulations prohibited it after certain hours. It was the kind of infraction that could result in a tow if reported. By midweek, my plan was starting to take shape. I knew I couldn't be obvious. If she suspected I was retaliating, she'd try to twist it into another HOA battle. No, I had to make it look like the consequences were simply the natural result of her own actions. All I had to do was give the right push at the right time. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Late one Thursday evening, I stepped outside to take out the trash and noticed her car parked exactly where it shouldn't be, blocking the sidewalk and sitting just far enough into the street to count as an obstruction. I took a quick set of time-stamped photos, cross-checked the footage from my security camera, and quietly made a call to the city's non-emergency parking enforcement line. They told me they'd send someone out in the morning. I smiled, knowing that Karen had no idea the trap had already been set. When I went to bed that night, I could already imagine the look on her face when she realized what was about to happen. What I didn't know yet was just how satisfying the next morning would be. The morning sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across driveways and lawns still damp with dew. I had barely poured my first cup of coffee when I heard the low, steady growl of an approaching diesel engine. My mind immediately went to the call I'd made the night before. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Peeking through the blinds, I saw the white city parking enforcement truck crawl down the street. It stopped directly in front of Karen's house, the officer inside scanning the curb, clipboard in hand. My pulse quickened as I realized just how perfectly the situation had aligned. Karen's car was still exactly where it had been the night before, half on the sidewalk, half in the street, a position that violated two separate parking ordinances. From my vantage point, I watched the officer step out, walk a slow circle around her car, and begin writing. The bright orange slip was placed neatly under her windshield wiper. A few minutes later, a tow truck arrived, this one an official city contractor, not the private kind Karen had called on me. Its hydraulic arm lowered with deliberate precision, the chains clinking as they wrapped around her tires. The sound was unmistakable. Even from inside my house, I could hear the mechanical whine as her car was lifted from the ground. The first tug tilted it at an awkward angle, the kind of sight that instantly sparks panic in any driver. I didn't have to wonder how she'd react, because seconds later, her front door burst open. Karen emerged in a flurry of motion, hair unkempt, still in her robe, waving her arms wildly at the tow truck driver. Even without hearing her words, her body language said everything: disbelief, outrage, the stubborn insistence that she was above the rules. She pointed toward my house once, maybe twice, as though trying to shift the blame, but the officer didn't so much as glance in my direction. This wasn't my doing, at least not on paper. This was a straightforward enforcement of city law. The tow truck driver didn't pause. The rear tires lifted completely off the ground, the truck eased forward, and just like that, Karen's spotless silver SUV was rolling away from her driveway. She stood there in the middle of the street, shouting at a vehicle that was already turning the corner and disappearing from sight. I sat back in my chair, the steam from my coffee curling upward like a victory flag. It wasn't the kind of revenge that required confrontation or messy arguments. It was clean, legal, and most importantly, undeniable. She had played herself. The rest of the morning was unusually quiet. Karen vanished into her house, curtains drawn, and didn't reappear for hours. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, though, and by midday, whispers had begun. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down as they passed her place, exchanging knowing glances. A couple of them even looked toward my driveway with a small, almost imperceptible nod. They had seen the way she targeted me. They knew she wasn't an innocent victim of bad luck. Still, I didn't gloat. Not openly, anyway. Revenge like this was most effective when it spoke for itself. My role was to act as though I had nothing to do with it, to let the city's own procedures stand as the sole cause. If Karen believed it was coincidence, maybe she'd think twice before coming after me again. But I underestimated her. The very next day, she reappeared, not with the subdued demeanor of someone who had just paid several $100s in towing and storage fees, but with an even sharper edge. Her posture was rigid, her eyes fixed on my house with renewed intensity. She might have been humiliated, but humiliation can harden into something dangerous when someone's ego is bruised badly. Enough. I soon noticed her pacing the sidewalk in front of her property, phone in hand, taking pictures not only of my car but of my yard, my mailbox, even the side of my house. She was looking for something, anything, that could be turned into ammunition. And she wasn't being subtle about it. That evening, I found yet another letter in my mailbox. This one was longer than the others, filled with citations of HOA bylaws, most of which had nothing to do with parking. She was expanding her scope now, trying to find new angles of attack. If the driveway battle was lost, she'd open a new front somewhere else. The part that unsettled me wasn't the letter itself, it was the realization that she wasn't just going to walk away. For her, this had become personal. And in neighborhoods like ours, personal grudges have a way of spiraling into all-out war. I knew then that the game wasn't over. Yes, her car had been towed, and yes, it had been deeply satisfying to watch. But Karen was regrouping. The look in her eyes when she passed my driveway told me she was already planning her next move. And if I wanted to protect my home, my peace, and my sanity, I would need to be ready for whatever came next.